Okay, so Aristotle is what we called in class a value pluralist. Lots of intrinsic values. Um, the hedonist is a value monist. There's just one, and it's pleasure. And so you can see how the hedonist, their value theory gives them a pretty easy route to a theory of the good life. If there's just one thing that's intrinsically good, pleasure, it makes sense that they then say, well, then the good life is just get as much of that as is feasible for a person. Aristotle, by contrast, has a whole bunch of different values. And, life is complicated. We have a limited amount of time and resources. Is there any kind of ranking here? Are some better than others? Are some such that they are easier to attain than others? And are some of them sort of more likely to bring about flourishing than others? How should we, in general, organize these goods across our life in order to make that life a flourishing one? And the answer, according to Aristotle, is not a get the most of any of them you can. He doesn't think that goodness is additive in the sense that we discussed when we discussed hedonism. You can't just take a single ice cream cone that's all by itself very tasty and not that bad for you, and just say, well, if one ice cream cone is good and brings me pleasure, then 15,000 ice cream cones eaten over the course of 2 days will be good and bring me pleasure. No, that's not how goods work of any sort. Aristotle is against this kind of maximizing picture of the good life. So this raises this question: what exactly should my life look like if I'm going to achieve the ultimate intrinsic good, which is eudaimonia? And Aristotle's answer to this essentially is that one of the intrinsic, non-ultimate intrinsic goods is such that it sort of brings with it all of the others in the right proportions. So that if you can have this one, you kind of get all the others as well. And once you have all of them and they're properly organized, you then will have a flourishing life. Well, what is this unique, non-ultimate intrinsic good? For Aristotle, it's moral virtue. Moral virtue, he thinks, brings with it pleasure. You feel good about having done something generous for another person. Moral virtue brings with it honor. For the most part, if you're in a normal society, you'll be recognized for having done good things. And this could open doors for you, and people will remember you long after your death as having been someone who made an impact on the world. Moral virtue also brings with it knowledge, and a really important kind of knowledge, a knowledge of right and wrong. You can't be virtuous without having knowledge of right and wrong. Moral virtue in general brings with it all of the other intrinsic goods. And so that's the sort of chief of the non-ultimate intrinsic goods, the one that if you can get that, you're guaranteed to have the ultimate good. So the formula we'll use for his theory of the good life is that the well-lived or flourishing or eudaimonic human life is the life of moral virtue. So I just have some examples of people that most of us think of as virtuous, as having led virtuous lives. Mother Teresa there on the left, Gandhi there in the middle, and then Martin Luther King Jr. on the right. These are the kinds of lives that Aristotle would have thought are the well-lived and best kind of human life. Doing good for others, developing virtue. Perhaps then we shall find this if we first grasp the function of a human being. For just as the good, or doing well, for a flautist, someone who plays the flute, he's always talking about flutes, A sculptor and every craftsman, and in general, for whatever has a function and characteristic action, seems to depend on its function. So just as the good for a flautist, that is, just as what it is to be good at playing the flute depends on the function of a flute player, and just as what it is to be a good sculptor depends on the function of a sculptor, and indeed every other craftsman, the good for that craftsman depends on its function, the same seems to be true of a human being if indeed the human being has a function. So what he's saying here is that in order to figure out what the good life for a human being is, we need to first determine what is the function of a human being. Here is the argument, and as we go, we're going to start to get clearer on what he means by a function, specifically of a human being, and we're also going to get clear on the relationship between the function of a thing and its happiness, or being a good member of the kind to which that thing belongs. We'll also get clear on specifically what Aristotle thinks the human function is, and that will deliver the conclusion that the good life for a human being is the life of moral virtue. So here are the premises. Premise 1, the good life for a human being is whatever life excellently fulfills the characteristic function of a human being. Premise 2, the characteristic function of a human being is an activity involving reason. Premise 3, the life of excellent activity involving reason just is the life of moral virtue. From this, it follows that the good life for a human being is the life of moral virtue. So let's go through those steps one by one, and some of these words look a little bit awkward and unfamiliar, but they'll begin to click as we go, I think. So this first premise makes this claim. The good life for a human depends on, or is determined by, whatever kind of life excellently fulfills the characteristic function. We don't yet know what the function of a human being is, but whatever it is, the good life for a human is one that fulfills that function well. Aristotle defends this claim by invoking what we're going to call the kind relativity thesis. Aristotle thinks that this isn't just true of human beings. As we saw in that passage, he thinks it's true of craftsmen. So the best sort of sculptor is determined by what a sculptor does, what a sculptor is for, what the function of a sculptor is. That's how you figure out whether someone's a good or a bad sculptor. More generally, the good life, existence, or way of being for a thing of kind K, where K is any kind whatsoever, is determined by the characteristic function of a K. Okay, let's try to make this more concrete with a non-human and non-living example. And then that should help illuminate the example of living beings and then humans eventually. So suppose we're trying to figure out what makes something a good chair as opposed to a bad chair. In order to answer that question, seems pretty plausible, we need to first make sure we're clear on what's the function of a chair? Like, what's it for, right? Pretty simple. The function of a chair is to be sat upon. And this is the kind of unique function of a chair. This is what distinguishes a chair from a table, a chair from a bookshelf, a chair from every other kind of furniture. The thing that's unique and characteristic and for which we have chairs is to put our weight upon and have a human being in a seated position, presumably in some way that's at least somewhat comfortable. Okay, once we have that in hand, that's the function of a chair, to be sat upon. Now we can determine what a good chair is. A good chair is just one that has all of the features that are necessary for it to perform its function well. So you need a chair that has legs in the right place, that can support the average human weight. You need to have you need to make sure that those legs are sturdy, right? There's no like cracks in them. You need to also presumably make sure there's a seat. If you just have some legs and like a plank of wood, I don't know, the plank of wood might give way, it might not be comfortable, so you need something by way of cushioning, and that definitely is going to distribute the weight appropriately across the legs so that it'll stand up. And then, ideally you also, this is maybe optional, have a back of some sort so that a human being can rest their back against that piece. And if you have all of those things, those are the things that make it possible for a chair to fulfill its function of being sat upon by a human being. And if those elements are jointly fulfill that function well, then you have a good chair on your hands. And that's just what a good chair is. It's to have those elements that make for the excellent fulfillment of the characteristic function of a chair. Conversely, we also now can determine what is a bad chair. Well, a bad chair is just one that has that lacks some of those features that provide for the ability to fulfill the function of a chair. So if you've got something that has legs, but one of them is really weak, such that when it's sat upon, it cracks and the person falls over, then it can't fulfill the function. Or maybe it kind of can briefly, but it can't do it well. Maybe because the person's going to be kind of rocking back and forth because it's a little bit unsteady and may or may not eventually fall. If you have like spikes, I don't know, lined on the seat, then no one could sit on it comfortably or without pain. So as you can see, this in the case of man-made things or human-made things, like sometimes called artifacts, physical objects like pieces of furniture, relatively easy and pretty plausible, this kind relativity principle, that the good life or good way of being for a thing of kind K is determined by its characteristic function. And Aristotle's insight is that what's true of pieces of furniture is true of everything. Specifically, if we want to know what makes something a good human being, what makes a human life a good one, we need to ask, what's the function of a human being? A good human life is going to be one that has whatever features are necessary to perform the characteristic function of a human being well. And this brings us to the next premise. What does Aristotle think the characteristic function of a human being is? Once we know that, we can plug that into that kind relativity principle, and we'll get something more specific about what elements I need in my life in order for my life to go well. Second premise is, according to Aristotle, the characteristic function of a human being is an activity, and this is really vague, involving reason. We're going to try to spell out what that means in a second. Some kind of rational activity, reason-driven action, is the characteristic function of a human. I just want to flag the characteristic function, importantly, for Aristotle, is not just something that we do, or not just something that something of a particular kind K does, but something that it does uniquely, right? So a chair could also be used as a doorstop. But being a doorstop is not the characteristic function of a chair. It may be a function, but it's not the uniquely chairish function. Being sat upon is. And likewise, when we turn to human beings, we're not just asking what's a thing a human being could do. We're asking what's something that is a characteristic of human beings, something they can do that sets them apart from other kinds of things. So Aristotle's argument for this second premise, that it's something about reason, is kind of a process of elimination argument. He says the characteristic function of a human is either biological life, that is like just being alive, or it's perceiving, that is using the five senses, or it's an activity of some sort involving reason. He then is going to go through, he says these are like the three most plausible options. I don't know if you've got a fourth one that doesn't fit into any of these categories, then that would be interesting to hear. But he thinks these are the two or these are the three best candidates, and he's going to eliminate the first two, and whatever we're left with then, which is an activity involving reason, he's going to conclude has got to be the characteristic function. So the next step in his defense of the second premise is the characteristic function of a human is not being biologically alive. Why not? Well, pretty straightforward. We are alive, so it is a function, but it's not our characteristic function. I mean, maybe you could hear my dog a second ago. He was rolling around. He's alive. He's not a human. All right, so we have to move on because that's not the characteristic function of a human. Nor is it, according to the third step, sense perception, taste, touch, sight, hearing, and smell. Those are things that, again, my dog does all of those things. He's a basset hound, so he loves to smell. He certainly loves certain sights. When he sees a squirrel or a little rodent, he certainly sees it. I know this because if I'm walking him, he will run off to try to get the squirrel, and this can like wrench my arm. And he also, my other dog, loves food. So all of the things that are, perceptual capacities that human beings have, those are shared with non-human animals. I should add here that this is the place where Aristotle begins to most severely depart from the hedonist. Aristotle's critique of the hedonist is essentially their account of the good life is completely detached from what makes us unique. We are not the only things that feel pleasure and pain. Indeed, virtually all living animals. I mean, I don't know if there are some weird jellyfish about whose like neural systems were not totally sure whether they give rise to pleasure and pain or not, but certainly all mammals feel pleasure and pain. And so the idea that the good life for a human is the life of maximal net pleasure is, according to Aristotle, deeply perverse in that the good life for a human should be something distinctively human. And pleasure and pain, good as they may be, are not distinctively human. So neither perception nor pleasure nor living are the things that make life go well for us. What we're left with then is that some kind of reasoned activity has got to be what makes us uniquely human and is our characteristic function. It's true that there are other animals that have certain very basic kinds of rationality, but Aristotle does think, and I think that contemporary science has borne this out. We have a unique ability to reason. We're the only things, living things, as far as we know, certainly on this earth, maybe in the universe, although we're obviously less sure of that. The only things that have a really robust and persistent conception of self, and this requires using like higher order thinking. We're the only things that can use language, which also requires reason. We're the only things that are capable of pausing and evaluating our own desires and our own perceptions and weighing future well-being against short-term well-being. My dog, when he sees that his food bowl is full, there is no deliberation. He doesn't think, should I save this food for later, or shall I indulge now? What are the costs and benefits of each course of action? He just has a desire. If he's hungry, that desire strikes him, and that moves his body to go get the food. For most of us, most of the time, that's not the way we work. We can, if we want to, resist that desire for food, and we use reason to do it. That's the thing that is unique about human beings, according to Aristotle.